All right. Thank you for joining us live for another edition of I'm a Black Woman. Yes, I matter. I'm so excited about our guest today, Josh Caldwell. We met just through Kismet online, and he's doing some really dope stuff that's all about allyship. It's about disruption. It's about bringing power back to the community. And I just thought it was so important that we had him on here. We're working together on some awesome stuff. So Josh, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. And second of all, that is a dope intro. First of all, I am very jacked up right now. That is a really sweet intro.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Well, again, thank you for having me. It's funny, my partner saw the marketing, and I think you touched on it. And she was, why is she having you on? Yes, I'm a Black woman. Or I'm a Black woman, yes, I matter. And then there's a photo of this random white dude. So I'm really excited to be able to come and speak to a different audience. And again, thank you so much for having me. As you intonated, we are a part of a project called RTF, which I guess in one sentence, and I'm sure we'll dive into it a little bit deeper, we believe in direct investment in gentrifying communities as a form of reparations. I guess is a quick one sentence, and I'm sure we'll dive deeper. But Kwamara and I met again through kind of Kismet, where it was basically me reaching out to a bunch of people who were smarter than me, trying to understand what we can do to address systemic inequity, right? And I think that's kind of where we started to chat. And we're 6 months into this now, and I think we're finally starting to hit our groove, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that really excited me was we talked extensively about the importance of changing ecosystems in order to change mindsets. And I would love to just dig a little bit deeper onto that, right? Because I've spent my career really in education. While I obviously will always think that education is super important for knowledge, for power, for understanding the structures of which we are operating, there is something about also being able to change ecosystems. And when you can change ecosystems, you change habits and you change mindsets.
Yeah, I think what you're touching on is super important because if we're going to boil it all down to something, right, we know that it's the colonized capitalist framework, right? So if we start from there, right, we have colonization and capitalism. And then from there, what we see is an otherization, right? A creation of tribalism where there needs to be winners and there needs to be losers in the system. So when we look at the history of the United States, when we look at the history of the globe, what we see is that otherization has typically been exponentially put on an economic class, but B, a racial class, a geographic class, right? So we know that this exponentially gets worse as you go throughout history. I mean, take a look at any continent that basically was imperialized, right? Reparations needs to be thought of as a function of addressing not only the colonized, but capitalist systems that have extracted value from these communities. So at RTF, we're looking at it in a micro sense of, okay, if we look at a gentrifying community as a really micro example of the colonized capitalistic extraction framework, let's start proving our concept there. And then we can kind of expand out and create a new version of a localized economy. But also we need to start understanding that capitalism has created this me versus you mentality that has been internalized, right? It's the American exceptionalism. It's the pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And everyone internalizes that, right? If you look at someone who's housing insecure, if you look at someone who is addicted to drugs, right? Oftentimes this is all framed in this idea of that person is morally responsible for this issue they have with themselves, right? But if you understand how crime works, if you understand the socioeconomic factors, the racial factors at play here, we understand that there are systems that are creating this outcome.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when we talk, there's always so much passion that goes back and forth in our conversations, and so I would love for you to talk about you walk as in the world as a white male. There's lots of privilege in that space, and yet you've decided to dedicate your life and truly dedicate your life. And we'll talk about this because I have some thoughts, and so do a lot of folks around people who start nonprofit organizations who don't look like the communities in which they're serving and what that actually looks like. But before we get into there and like dig deep and really have some call outs and some honest conversation, I want to talk about like what's the passion that drives you to have decided to start this organization, to be so passionate and be so intentional in the way that you put it together. I mean, if you look at the board is predominantly Black, people of color, women. You really listen, take those notes, and then you're actionable. So I would love to hear just a little bit more about like where does that passion come from? Where's this drive come from?
I mean, honestly, it started out, it's still probably very much rooted in a weird sense of selfishness, right? And what I mean by that is and I tell this to everyone I speak to, this journey started very much as a symptom of me handling my own mental health. So I think a lot of people had the social justice awakening around George Floyd, right? And then COVID also kind of led to this awakening of labor. So, valuing yourself, valuing your extractive value, right? And so for me, COVID caused me to have an internal conversation of, okay, well, I'm not drinking anymore. I can't work in the capitalist system and distract myself because everyone's closed down in COVID. My partner and I were running a bakery that was working with breweries, right? So that closed down. So now I'm stuck in a 200 square foot room with my partner, our toddler, her grandmother. And I'm like, all right, what am I going to do now? And for me, I'd always been really, really interested in how our systems really fuck everybody's day up. I'm sorry, I don't know if I can swear. Is that okay?
You can totally swear.
Okay. Right. So like for me, I'm a big data person. I really like to educate myself because I have a chip on my shoulder about people not thinking I'm smart. So I continually try to educate myself. And what I started to find was that like through reading things like Heather McGee's The Sum of Us, right? Through reading things like Mickey Kendall's Hood Feminism, what we start to understand is that these systems of oppression really have a negative outcome for everybody, regardless of skin color, right? So economically, just going back to my childhood, I grew up in what everyone in my school considered the wrong side of the tracks, right? For all you history buffs out there, people always ask my why. I like to compare myself to the West Virginians right after the Civil War during reparations, right? Where like economically, I have a lot more in common with the free slaves at that time, right? But what our systems did and what our government did and what white supremacy did was instead of allowing those two groups to come together as a solidified movement, they otherized Black, brown, and indigenous people. They created this idea that like if they get some sort of freedom, if they get some sort of equity, then it's taking away from the white system, right? The zero-sum mentality. So for me, once I realized kind of where I stood in that dichotomy within our current systems, I had an honest conversation with myself. And I was really good at arguing on Twitter, but that's performative as shit, right? So it was, okay, how can I make a real difference? I started reaching out to see if I could do free consulting with Black, brown, indigenous-led organizations. And then I started to just kind of iterate into what we have now as our various RTF frameworks, which we'll get into a little bit further. And that's kind of how we ended up here.
Yeah. So let's get into it a little bit. So how do we talk about the idea that, in this nonprofit world, in this space, it's oftentimes, right? It's about white leaders coming together and saying like, hey, Black folk, hey, indigenous people, hey, community, and we know that you guys are suffering, or we're assuming that you guys are suffering and you're having all of these issues, and we have the solution. And then we can go to our white corporate donors and we can get the money to actually do the work, and yet not having a real sense of the community. So how do you sort of counteract and counterbalance that as you started the structures of the organization?
So the first thing I did was I wrote a bunch of frameworks that I thought would work. But before I went and like said anything to anyone, I went and talked to the community a bunch. Right. So it was me, for marketers out there, it was me A/B testing a lot of like, hey, I think this is a good idea. But hey, I'm also a cisgendered white dude. I want to make sure this is not framed in my whiteness. Right. So a lot of it is, again, being intentional in what you're doing and being introspective. That's not to say that, of course, like there haven't been hiccups for me, because again, I still live in a society that conditions me to believe that I am the narrator of the story for everyone, right?
Mhm.
So it's about constant introspection and then constant open conversations with the community. So for us, it was, reaching out to as many individuals who would talk to us, saying, "Hey, we think this could work. Well, what about this?" Readjusting our frameworks, and then again, making sure that we're constantly empowering the community to be a part of our framework, right? So the problem with traditional philanthropy is exactly what you're saying, right? It's this performative act by predominantly white people to continue to enrich themselves in the board, in the C-suite. I just shared an article on LinkedIn about St. Jude that pulls in around $2 billion a year in fundraising, right? They make more than the next 10 hospitals on the list for children, but they still have parents sleeping in the parking lot, right? Because they only cover one person's travel, right? So there's this idea that like philanthropy is really a band-aid that is used for white performativeness. And all it does is it really changes the outcome in a very small micro sense. And then they use that as a performative, what? Everything's better now, right? As opposed to we need to change all of the systems that lead to that outcome and ensure it won't continue to happen.
Yeah, so let's talk about it. Let's dig into the actual philosophies, the frameworks, how it actually works, how can people who want to be part of the organization come partner? So let's talk a little bit about that framework.
Yeah, so if you've followed RTF at all on LinkedIn, you've probably seen a bunch of iterations of us in like the last 6 months, right? And a lot of that does come from the constant iterations and constant conversations we're having with people, right? So if you want to participate, the whole point of our organization is equitable participation, regardless of what you're typically bringing to the table, right? So when we started to first put out, job applications, right, or job descriptions, I didn't put out job descriptions because I think job descriptions literally just are a function of access, right? Anything in a job description is a function of like, hey, have you had the ability to go to school? Have you had the ability to get this training, to have this experience, right? So for us, like there are things that we want to do long term, like open hiring. So again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but our general structure is we want to utilize small dollar donors to directly invest in community-owned organizations, starting in gentrifying communities that will fill the gaps of equity at a local level. So what that, sorry, go ahead.
And I was going to say, and don't forget to talk a little bit about the capacity building structure that you have in place for some of the nonprofit organizations, some of the grassroots community organizations, right? Because oftentimes there's a lack of knowledge, structure, capacity. And so how are we going to help build up that capacity, that knowledge base to really ensure that the power is back into the community?
Exactly. Yeah. So part of that funding structure is what we have called nucleus. So nucleus is a function of what we call is our human theory, right? So if we think of participation with our organization, we look for humans, and those come in two forms, right? A human organization or a human as an individual. And so basically participation is predicated solely on being mission aligned. And so what we look to do is we look to create this socialized network of organizations and people that bring all these different skill sets, all these different things, and have different bandwidth. And the idea being that through this network, we can A, create new entities that will fill gaps, but B, engage with current entities that are already doing the hard work, right? There are Black, Brown, Indigenous, women-led organizations that have been running for decades that have not gotten nearly as much attention as I have in 6 months of doing this. Want to take a guess why? It's the beard. It's the beard. It's yeah. So for me, that's very much how.
Actually, I want us to dig deep a little bit more on that. I just came from listening to an awesome conversation for 3 days. It's called the Black Policy Lab, and the last panel that I was listening to was about mom hustlers. So Black women in the community who are moms who are out here, to your point, doing grassroots events. Some had been had been around for 10 years and having no funding whatsoever. And then, of course, all of a sudden, because of the racial I hate to say awakening, it's not really true. The racial reawakening, the emergence, whatever, that brought to light, then funding was starting to come through. But I want to talk to you about what you just said, because it is so important. There are organizations that are led by Black women, that are led by Indigenous women, that have been around for 20 years, who are trying to scrape by nickel and dime, getting a little bit of money here and there from the community. And in 6 months, you've gotten a lot more press, a lot more attention. We can all kind of figure out why, but let's dig deep into that, because that really shows a little bit more around this what's going on. It shows a lot around what is the racism that is happening here within the United States, right? That there's this belief system that what Black women are doing is stuff that we're supposed to always do because we're strong Black women. We don't need the money to do it because why? we can't figure out our own problems. We always have to be told what to do. And so here you are, you've got this organization, and people are finding it exciting because here you are, a white man who's thinking about going back into the community, and so you're getting a lot of press. Talk to me a little bit about how that's making you feel as a founder, nonprofit organization, and when people come at you about it, how do you maneuver those conversations, and what is this telling you about the state of the U.S. in 2021?
So there's a couple of things there. So one, I think we're getting an interesting amount of traction via the forums we're using, like LinkedIn. Unfortunately, I don't think we're getting as much press as I would hope we would get. But in relation to support that other organizations get, especially majority owned organizations, the idea being that there's certainly an imbalance, right? There's an imbalance between airtime. There's an imbalance between funding to those organizations. So for me personally, the hardest part I've had with navigating this structure, this entity, this industry, is decentering myself from the conversation, but B, also making sure that when things do come up, because they're gonna come up, that I need to really understand to decenter myself from it and not take it necessarily personally, right? Because I am emblematic, I'm representative of a lot. And the more publicity I get, the more airtime I get on channels like this, the reality of the situation is that regardless of intent, regardless of anything, that I am still very much emblematic of the systems that everyone is trying to address, right? So there's a trust issue first and foremost. So we're doing things like we're implementing an OBM strategy where, for those who don't know, it's an open book management strategy. We want to create 100% transparency with our financials, right? So, St. Jude's took in $2 billion. In 6 months, I've taken in 3,500. And 2,200 of that was what I put in, right? So, it's not like we're raking in the donations right now. But the way we want to utilize my whiteness really is a function of getting access to institutional funding that isn't necessarily always available. And then we have a long-term program called our DCIFs, which are a function of our funding mechanism. But the idea being that pieces of those funding strategies in the long term would go to those Black, Brown, and Indigenous run organizations so they could have a constant source of funding without having to plead for the white dollar. So that's kind of our long-term plan.
I love that idea, and I want to just bring it up again. So using your white privilege as a tool and a means to refunnel dollars, to change ecosystems, and to decentralize whiteness from the conversation. That is powerful. If you guys are looking to figure out who can be an ally in this space, someone who says, use me authentically. And that's exactly what you're saying, Josh. And that's one of the things that I really understood and heard when we had that conversation. The other piece, and you brought it up a couple of times, is this human-centered design. And I absolutely believe that there is a lack of a humanistic approach, a lack of empathy in the ways that we interact with people, and the ways that the media talks about folks, in the ways that we couch victims, who's considered a victim, in the ways that we talk about poverty, and the ways that we enumerate people who are wealthy. It's amazing the different ways in which we are doing that. So I would love to talk about it, because a lot of times the work that we do, not only for I'm a Black woman, yes I matter, but also for tech in general, is that we come up with human, equitably centered, and empathetic centered design thinking to change cultures, organizational cultures, and frameworks. Right? It's one thing to get Black people, BIPOC people into the door, but are they going to stay in your culture if you don't have a human, empathetic, and equitable design culture? So, can you talk a little bit more about why you so emphasize the human aspect of the work that we're doing, to the point where it literally just says "be human"? Right? People don't even have titles; it's just a humanistic title first.
Yeah, well, because again, I think this really again boils down to what capitalism in the colonized framework has conditioned us all to believe, right? So again, it's this otherization, it's this creating this tribalistic winner loser dichotomy, right? Because I don't want to get too deep into theory around business, but capitalism as a function of our society is literally created to drive shareholder value. And what that means is they have a fiduciary duty to cut as much cost as possible to make sure that the people who are owners, predominantly white, predominantly rich, get richer. And what that means is that is predominantly taken out on the labor class, right? And that means that your Black, brown neighborhoods end up dumping sites for chemicals, right? It means that infrastructure is never updated in Flint, because all this money gets funneled into corporatism. And so the way we look at ourselves at RTF is not only explicitly changing equity as a function of our external methodology, we're using ourselves internally as a blueprint, but also as a test dummy, right? So like the first meeting I had with our former lawyer was, I want to pay everyone quarterly up front when we're funded. Now, of course, everybody said no. We negotiated down to monthly. So if we ever get funded, what we're going to be doing is we're paying everyone a base salary the first of the month up front, regardless of value extracted, right? And when I tell people that, everyone's like, oh, you're just going to pay me not to do anything? That's great. But I'm like, that's people taking this moralistic viewpoint, right? Like, oh, if you're just going to get free money, you're going to be a freeloader. I don't think people are like that, right? I think that if you pay someone their base salary, which we have pay equality at every level of our organization. So we have 3 paid levels. We have our apprentice or continuing education. Again, I don't like the word intern because it implies this extracting. We have our directors, which equate to our part-time-ish employees. And then once you've been a director for 6 months, you can apply to be a co-founder. A co-founder gets a vote in the organization like you would as a partner in a law firm. But the idea being that we want anybody who is mission aligned and engaged with us to have a say in what we're doing, right? So part of that is empowering everybody, regardless of, again, what you would consider their tangible worth, their tangible value. It's about not enforcing a work week for us. So where it's capable, work wherever you need to work from, right? We all have families, we all have kids. Our idea is you are a human and you deserve a base pay and you deserve to work when you can, if you can, regardless, right? And then the final thing we're doing, which I think is low-key kind of like the most revolutionary thing we're doing, but we're creating this multivariate formula that we're going to try and pay out our bonuses quarterly, but our bonuses are going to take into account things like historical oppression. So we want to literally pay you more if you are a Black woman, if you're a woman, if you experience subjugation in our community, it literally costs you more, right? So for us, equity means being able to address that from a dollar value. It's not going to change everything, but again, it starts to create that conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to your point around everyone having a livable wage or base salary, there have been studies right around countries who have given out, and cities who have done universal basic income, and they're like, people are not just lazing around like, oh man, I've got this extra money, right? They're like excited. They're putting that money back into the economy. They're going to go out and getting education. They're trying to better themselves and the situation for their own family. So it's actually been nothing but positive effects when you think about just giving someone a livable wage, a base salary. It actually motivates them to be more loyal to the economy, to the system, of which gave them that sort of gave them that leeway, right? Instead of struggling paycheck to paycheck, which obviously has such a traumatic toll when you're constantly thinking about money, when you're thinking about stress. And we know stress is actually one of the leading causes of death, really, in this country. So it is a lifesaver if we can start thinking more holistically about universal basic income. But then, of course, that has to change mindset. So we can't equate how much money you have to a moral value. There's no morality when it comes to your money, your net worth, etc. I want to, and on that point, I want to go back to something you said after the Civil War, and that the poor West Virginians and the free slaves. It is amazing, and we talk about it a lot in our community, amongst my friends, amongst peers, colleagues, etc. How often white people really vote against their own interests, right? Because if you voted with a more progressive agenda, you wouldn't have to worry about scraping by paycheck to paycheck. You wouldn't have to worry about where things are. You wouldn't have to worry about whether or not you're going to call the ambulance, or if you can pay this medical bill, or if you're going to go into debt, or you're going to have to do bankruptcy, etc. And yet the narrative is so ingrained that there's something wrong, morally wrong, about aligning yourselves with more progressive thinking, with the thinking of Black people in general. So I would like let's uncover that just a little bit more, because it is actually the most fascinating thing that I see happen every election cycle, and then of course the biggest stories for the last 4 to 8 years have been how often white women have 100% voted against their own interests, right? But in that case, we kind of understand, they're centering whiteness first, and I guess that's the answer. Everyone is centering whiteness first, and that's how I guess wow, that's like maybe that is the answer. What do you think, Josh?
I mean, I think that's definitely a part of the answer, right? I mean, it's a slight parallel, but Britt Marling is a phenomenal female writer, director, actress. She has I'm going to do a quick plug for her. The show, The OA, it got canceled after its second or third season. Shouldn't have. It's horrible. But she wrote a fascinating op-ed where basically she started writing her own roles because she was so sick of the stereotypical female role in Hollywood. But she was also super sick of what was basically the female role written via the patriarchal, misogynistic viewpoint, where it's like the female action hero, right? And so she started to question, like, what is actually a feminist outside of the patriarchal system? What does it really mean to be a woman, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, I think that, I don't know why that was what popped into my head for your question, but for me, I think it's very emblematic of like whiteness, but whiteness has always been a function of success, right? So if you look back to like right after climate theory, right? So for those who don't know climate theory was this idea that Black and darker skinned people, as they got to European zones, would become whiter again, right? It's this idea that it was a function of climate. So once they started to understand that that wasn't how, race worked or melatonin worked, they started to transition into basically the Christian idea that you could only be a saved soul if your soul was white. So the closer to whiteness you got is the closer to, earthly success, but also spiritual success. Mm-hmm. So if you fast forward now to whiteness in America, what we start to see is all of this has been boiled into this idea of American exceptionalism. And so all of these white people basically have been brainwashed into thinking that they did it by themselves. They raised themselves up. They didn't use government programs, even though they did. They didn't use free labor, even though they did. right? So they had access to all of this stuff. If you haven't read Heather McGee's The Sum of Us, she is, oh my God, I would love to get her involved. She's so damn important and busy. One day we'll get her, Quamara. But she did an analysis around this idea that, you know, pre Black people in the civil rights movement, right? Getting access to certain social safety nets, you know, white people overwhelmingly approved of those programs, right? They approved of welfare. They approved of food stamps. They approved of housing. They approved of free community college. That was a thing in the United States. Like, we had free community college, and then they decided to take it away, right? Probably the most famous parallel she draws in her book is the idea around public pools, right? So there was a time in our history where we started to desegregate public pools. And what did white people do? They closed down the public pools, opened up private pools, and then wouldn't allow people of color in there. And what did that lead to? That led to this idea that Black people couldn't swim, right? This led to all this other stuff. So it's just that it's a lie, right? We always talk about the big lie now with the electoralism. You want to know what the real big lie is that like whiteness got here on its own.
You said a word, Josh. That is the biggest lie, that whiteness got here on its own. Man, I think we're at time anyway. That's like the best way for us. That is like the best way for us to wrap up. Man, Joshua, thank you so much for being our guest today. I hope I learned a lot talking to you. Guys, definitely check out RTF. Not only is he a founder, but I'm also a founding board member. So I'm really excited about the work that we're doing that are going to change ecosystems, that are going to bring the power back to the community, and refunnel the money, right? We have so much money and power as a community, and yet we believe that, again, there's another lie, and yet we believe that it only lives in 1% of the population. No, guys, we can take it back. We're the consumers who are giving it to them. We can take it back. And so this is the work that we're trying to do at RTF. So again, thank you so much, Josh. I really appreciated talking to you.
Thank you so much.